This talk would not have been possible without Shirley, my wife, if she will stand up for a moment. About a week ago, I had the talk completely finished, and then I showed it to her. And she said, well, I take out this part, that part, and it's too long and too horrid. And so what you're seeing tonight is a sanitized version, but it's still one that I think packs the impact. The real question that many of you will want to have answered is, why discuss smallpox? The last case of smallpox in the world was in 1977, and the World Health Organization declared it completely gone by 1979. Why discuss it? Well, we are fascinated with smallpox. This appeared in the Arizona Star just a month ago, because we're still debating whether the two reservoirs of smallpox virus, the virus itself, in Russia and in the United States should be destroyed. And that argument actually started 30 years ago, because it was felt that the scientists felt they needed this in order to protect against bioterrorism, because they weren't sure that smallpox virus wasn't, in fact, in many places around the world surreptitiously. And so they persuaded then President Clinton not to allow the virus to be destroyed. And as a result, that debate has gone on and it is now renewed. Secondly, we're celebrating our centennial, as you all know, next February 12th. And the Arizona Star has been publishing articles from February and March of that last year. They publish this regularly, and these two appeared on smallpox. One about the pest house that Jim was referring to, in which children were confined when they had smallpox, and they needed clothing when they were healing, so that one of the articles discusses that, and the other discusses the control of smallpox in February of exactly 100 years ago. It wasn't very well controlled, as I'll show you. A very, very short course on smallpox. This is the virus. It's a huge virus. It is just under the size of bacteria and much bigger than viruses like polio. And it's become very valuable, the virus itself, because the DNA can incorporate other antigens, other components in it, and produce antigens for vaccines. So a lot of people are working with its companion virus, vaccinia virus, in that regard. Now, it's important to know about the transmission for two reasons. One is the normal way you get smallpox is because somebody coughs or sneezes or discards the virus from their skin, and you inhale it, and that sets up the process. However, bedding and other objects in the environment also become contaminated, and in fact, it's been shown for years later that you can become infected with smallpox. In fact, the Chinese in 1000 BC dried pus from smallpox patients and blew it into the noses of susceptibles in order to protect them, and the virus was in fact preserved. So that will figure in one aspect of the story of smallpox in the Americas. You get infected, and about 2 weeks later, plus or minus, this process starts. And first it starts with little flat red marks on your skin and progresses through, can you all see that? It progresses through vesiculation, that is accumulation of pus under the skin, and eventually to scabbing and ultimately to scarring. Since we can't really treat smallpox, people may attempt to classify it. The discrete form is the mildest form of the disease, usually occurring in individuals. Let me get out of your way. Can you still hear me in the back? Steve, can you hear me? The discrete form of the disease is simple. Can you still see me? Yeah. The discrete form of the disease is the mildest form. Then there's semi-confluent, where the lesions start to come together. And finally, there is confluent disease, which, as you'll see, figures in our story because the Native Americans termed this rotting face. And it had a prominent place in Native American lore about this disease. About 30% of individuals who get smallpox will die, and that's composed of a number of groups. The unvaccinated, about half die. However, hemorrhagic and flat disease, which are very serious forms of the disease, occur in pregnant women, very young children, the elderly, and that approaches 100%. So it's a blend of each of these types of illnesses that result in the overall 30% mortality. We believe that from a lot of work that was done that this is because T-cell deficient individuals are the ones that have the most severe form of the disease. And we now know that virgin soil epidemics, that is, if you introduce a virus like smallpox or measles into a population that's never seen it, it has the most devastating effects, up to 90% or 95% mortality. And in vaccinated populations, it's very variable. It can be no symptoms at all if you've been vaccinated, to mild to moderate disease, and the mortality is only 1 to 10% in vaccinated individuals, less than 10 years post-vaccination to 20+% later on. Now, since time immemorial, as I mentioned previously, people have attempted to solve this problem. They really didn't understand infection or transmission, but they knew that people who were in contact with people who had smallpox tended to get smallpox, and the Chinese were wise enough that they actually were able to take material from the individual and inject it by various means into susceptibles, who then got a very mild case of smallpox and were protected. That happened 1000 BC. That idea, when trade with the Far East occurred, transmitted itself to Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and was practiced for many, many years. And then all of you know the famous story of Mrs. Lady Montagu, who went to Turkey, where she saw this in about the early 20th century, and she brought it back to England, and it became introduced there, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. In 1796, Jenner noted that a nursemaid who was milking cows, milkmaid milking cows, claimed that they could not get the disease because they got cowpox. And so he took that one observation and from a series of elegant experiments over time, developed vaccination. Now this diagram shows where the disease originated, probably at least in 1500 BC. We know that mummies, for example, have been shown to have smallpox scarring in Egypt, and the disease then traveled along various travel routes to the Far East and all the way into Europe and Africa. And it's Europe and Africa that we're interested in because by the 15th century, smallpox was well ensconced in Europe and was happening regular epidemics. Now, what was America like before Columbus and colonization occurred? Well, the Bering Strait was not a strait, it was a land bridge. And we now know from genetic studies that individuals traveled all the way from Africa across the various continents, crossed the Bering land bridge, and spread throughout North and South America. There were scattered tribal populations. They had various cultures, beliefs. There are multiple various Native American tribes throughout all of the Americas. It's interesting, as you read about this history, it depends on your ethnocentric viewpoint. Some people think there were only about 8 million Native Americans throughout all of the Americas. Others say it was 120 million. And that became known as the low counter, high counter controversy. The low counters felt that they were accurate historians without an axe to grind. The high counters were trying to prove that we literally, we being the Western world, decimated the Native American population, and therefore 120 million got reduced to a few million after the importation of these diseases. There is no evidence, although the historical record is difficult because it was mostly an oral tradition, but there was no evidence in the Western Hemisphere that any of these diseases that we know familiarly were prevalent in Europe and Africa, measles, malaria, smallpox, plague, etc., none of those diseases seem to have occurred in America. Now, there's a famous theory and understanding called the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus. A historian in 1972 coined this phrase to try to explain the interaction between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And it's the exchange of people, of culture, animals, and plants. We all know that the Indians introduced corn, for example, that was unknown in Europe, and horses were introduced to the Indians, and they were unknown. That was unknown in the Americas. But there were other importations and exchanges that weren't so friendly and weren't so useful. Human diseases were shared. Syphilis probably went from Native Americans to Europe, and actually was a deadly, deadly disease in Europe. It was a very severe form of the disease. And smallpox, measles, and other communicable diseases were imported to America. The historians feel this is probably the single most massive change in human culture that has ever been encountered in recordable history. That is, the ecology, agriculture, and even the culture of each side was significantly changed as a result of this barter. Now, there are some contentious issues as I tell you the story. The historical facts are extremely difficult to be certain about. There were not a lot of extensive written records. There was a lot of oral tradition among Native Americans, and many of these were diary entries or official records where the individual had a reason for recording what they recorded. And it was recorded from their viewpoint, not necessarily objectively. And then in later times, people began to look at the exploitation of the Indians and the decimation of the Native Americans, and genocide became an issue, and sometimes the writings are slanted in order to prove that point. That was the high counter versus low counter controversy. And then scholars like to argue with each other, and sometimes those disputes led to completely different views of the same event. Now, the first exchange actually did not come with Columbus's first voyage in 1492. It was his second voyage in 93 in Hispaniola, where a major epidemic broke out, and it was felt to be probably smallpox. Many people believe, in fact, that it was, although some historians think it may have been influenza or it may have been confused. In 1503, the first African slaves were brought over in order to help with the agricultural development. And there are two theories that run through this literature. One is that it was introduced from Africa because smallpox was endemic in that population, and the length of the trip was enough to sustain smallpox during the ride across the ocean. Others feel that many of the Spanish and other European individuals were also vectors. The best documented introduction was the one that occurred in 1519. Cortés was being chastised by the Spanish royalty, and they sent Narvaez to arrest Cortés. Unfortunately, he had with him an African slave who was sick with smallpox. And that individual resulted in almost 2 to 15 million Aztecs having died as a result of that single introduction. And it was well documented by the missionaries and the officials at the time in terms of the propagation of that epidemic. By 1520, the Incas were infected, and as much as 85% of the population is estimated to have died. And Guatemala recorded an epidemic in 1519, and it was recorded by oral, a written down statement from one of the Guatemalan natives. Great was the stench of the dead. After our fathers and grandfathers succumbed, half the people fled the fields. Dogs and vultures devoured their bodies. And that was from a survivor of the epidemic. By 1520, it's estimated that 3 million Arawak people were dead. De Soto then introduced it into the southeast United States with multiple diseases occurring, including plague and typhus, as well as measles and smallpox. And measles spread and killed, they believe, 75% of the Native Americans in that area. And then the pattern of disease thereafter spread in individual epidemic clusters that killed large numbers of close living people that I'll explore with you in a little more detail. The Portuguese in Brazil, Massachusetts Bay, Hurons in the west, in the Great Lakes and in Canada, Dutch introducing smallpox into Connecticut, and many epidemics decimated Indians throughout the then northern America. But the real story was in the 18th and 19th century, and the major impact consisted of rapid spread. We began to expand it as a new territory, and people began moving throughout the continent. Religious conversion practices occurred. There were accusations of genocide. There was an epidemic in Boston. I'll go through each of these. There was a massive multi-year epidemic, destroyed much of the Native American population. This was when the greatest effect occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries. And actually, smallpox is believed to have influenced the outcome of the Revolutionary War, and the geographic nature of the United States itself was partially determined by smallpox, and the population and culture of the western states where we live actually was changed by this disease. Now, if you look at these two maps, which indicate this is where smallpox occurred. This is the Mexican Peninsula, Baja, and up into southwestern United States. And when you looked at where these epidemics were occurring, it was in the missions and in the villages. And you'll see that this has a lot to do with how it occurred. Why link this to conversion practices? Well, if you took a Native American tribe that was in fact living in isolated homes and teepees, other kinds of buildings that were scattered, they seldom came together except for rites. What the missionaries did is brought them all together, put them together in a confined space while they undertook conversion, and as a result, when smallpox was introduced, 90% of the patients would die. And that's documented. Was there deliberate genocide? During the French and Indian War, Sir Amherst said to Colonel Bouquet in 1763, "Could it not be contrived to send smallpox among these disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." The response was, "I will try to inoculate the blank with some blankets that may fall in their hand and take care not to get the disease myself." There is no subsequent proof that, in fact, Bouquet did that, but a Captain Euchre at Fort Pitt, when they were being besieged by the surrounding tribes, actually entered into his diary, "Out of our regard for them, 2 Indian chiefs, we gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect." What happened is both the troops and the Native Americans died in huge numbers. From the historical record, as best as I could determine from reading a whole variety of original sources, it appears that smallpox most often spread by natural means, although the claims have been made that genocide occurred and simply wasn't documented. There's no way from the record to prove that one way or another, except for that one instance. What about smallpox in other than the native populations? In April of 1721, a steamer docked in Boston, and a black seaman came down with smallpox. He was put in a house with a red flag. Red was thought to be a symbol that helped ward off smallpox. It was sort of a medieval myth. There was rapid spread, and by May were epidemic proportions. Cotton Mather, who was, as you know, was a religious, very famous person in Boston at the time, his slave, Atticus, told him that he contracted, he was variolated, which I explained earlier was the introduction by injection of a pus from a material into a susceptible, and if the person got a mild form of the disease, they were protected. He told Dr. Boston, who was a surgeon at the time, about this, and in fact, Boston began with great controversy, and this is all told in Jennifer Carroll's wonderful novel called The Speckled Monster that many in this room have read, and if you haven't, it's a wonderful historical novel that depicts what happened during this epidemic. The fact is that about 56% of the population in Boston were affected, and about 14% died. However, among Boylston individuals who were variolated, including his own children, the death rate was only 2.4%. The next importation came later, and again, there were regular importations years after as ships and traders have arrived. This is the book that I mentioned, The Speckled Monster by Jennifer Lee Carroll, who's Bill Carroll's daughter, and who's written 4 novels now, but this was her first. Now, in that 1775-82 epidemic, which occurred years after that initial Boston, there were documented 130,000 deaths. And this was a burial statistic in 96 parishes in New Spain. Those peaks occurred during this epidemic, showing that the burial rate really did reach the proportions that I'm talking about, with 75 to 90% of individual populations actually dying from the disease. Now, what does George Washington have to do with smallpox? Well, first of all, he and his brother went to Barbados because his brother Lawrence was sick, probably with TB, and a trip was made to help cure him. They were invited to visit Mr. Clark, a merchant planter, and Lawrence said he didn't want to go because there was smallpox in the family, but he was persuaded to do it out of politics, and George came down with smallpox. And he was strongly affected and it lasted almost a month. What does that have to do with the Revolutionary War? Well, the British were trapped in Boston in '75 while this epidemic was raging, and they were there because they had lost at Lexington and Concord, as you know. Washington had smallpox and knew that he was protected. He considered variolation, that is the introduction of this pus material to his troops, but he thought it was too risky. And instead he used isolation, quarantine, they dipped supplies and letters in vinegar, they banned imported personnel from infected areas, etc., in an attempt to control it, but it wasn't controlling it. So in '77, after many attacks of smallpox occurred, he vacillated and adopted the policy of variolation for his army. This saved the U.S. Many historians, including the latest biography of Washington, unearthed this information and felt that the British literally died from smallpox while the Americans were protected. And as a result, the war swung towards our side at the time. Now, geographically, Quebec is Canadian. It should have been in the United States. George Washington ordered General Charlotte to invade Quebec, and Benedict Arnold was put in charge. And the Army had a terrible trip. If you read accounts of this, they had all kinds of physical problems, health problems, food problems, but the controversy over variolation really took command. General Benedict actually said, let's do it. But General Thomas came along and countermanded the order, and then he himself got smallpox and died. The disease raged throughout the Army, and the Army retreated, and Quebec then became part of Canada. It should be been part of the United States, according to historians. In the 19th century, we began then to see this Western invasion of smallpox. There were many epidemics, as I pointed out, among the missionaries, particularly in the southern part of the North American continent. But the fact is that most of the West were populated by Indians who had little or no contact until fur trading began. And it began to be big business. And I'm going to tell you about the St. Peter trip in just a minute. But this probably resulted in the entire West being affected, including Canada. Now, this is the trip. And this is really a fascinating story if anyone wants to read about man's inability to deal with disease. They sailed from St. Louis because the Indians up here were stockpiling thousands of buffalo robes, which were very much in vogue at the time. And they needed to get the steamship up to pick those up and bring them back down to St. Louis where the end could be distributed. However, a few days after the sailing, a deckhand became sick, and they wanted to drop him off in the forest along the way. And the captain, there are two stories. One says the captain was a humanitarian and said, "We can't leave this poor man in the forest with no food, no water. He'll die." The other says he was really a blackguard who said, "I don't care, we need him to help us haul on when he gets well." Whichever, they kept him on board ship. They also picked up some Native American women along the way who became infected. And as a result, as they traveled up the river, they began to infect individuals along the way. By the time they ended the trip in June of 1924, they had infected every tribe along the way. And from there, the epidemic spread into Canada and to the southern, as the fur trade began to prosper in those regions. They think at least 20,000 American Indians died as a result of this single steamship. The Mandans in the northern part of what now is the United States were left with very few survivors, and some tribes lost as many as 50%. Now, what about modern times? We have controlled smallpox by vaccination, and the last documented case in the United States actually occurred in Texas. There were 6 or 7 cases in 1949. The United States ended vaccination in 1972. One of my mentors, C. Henry Kemp, really led that effort because we no longer had the disease and the vaccine was causing more problems than the disease. In 1958, as I pointed out, the World Health Organization targeted smallpox, and by 1975, the effort was complete, and the last cases occurred in Africa in 1977. There were 2 laboratory cases in England in 1979, which is one of the reasons that people who want to destroy the viruses feel that there still is a danger. This is a chart showing the number of countries in Africa, Asia, Americas, and Europe that were infected beginning in 1920. And if you look and see how the decline occurred, and when the resolution for intensified smallpox eradication occurred between 1959 and 1966, the disease disappeared. Our last case was in 1949. Now, why was there such a high mortality among Native Americans? No one knows for sure. We simply don't have the tools or the history to understand that. Some suspect that there were immune variation, that for a long time it was felt that blood group O made you more susceptible. It turned out that studies didn't show that. So modern studies among the descendants of the various tribes cast doubt on this theory. The virgin soil theory I've told you about. If you have a group that has no immunity whatsoever and you introduce one case, it spreads. There's nobody to take care of the sick. There's no one that's immune, and as a result, everybody gets infected. And the dense population, and particularly bringing normally nomadic tribes or tribes that were scattered into villages or into missionaries, led to rapid, extensive disease. Smallpox is a crowd disease. You get it when you're in a crowd. And then I'll talk a little bit about native healing practices. Some people attribute the high mortality to this. Now, what did the Native Americans believe? Well, first of all, they had no idea of human transmission, and therefore none of these patients were ever isolated or quarantined early on. People took care of them. That was the tribal belief. You had somebody sick, you took care of them. Well, that taking care of them meant that 2 or 3 people who were taking care of them got infected as well and then spread it. Most of their beliefs were supernatural. The northern tribes believed that this was punishment for mistreatment of animals or humans. The Creeks and the Cherokees believed it was a violation of tribal laws, particularly sexual promiscuity among young men. The Cree believed it was God's anger expressing itself in the form of the disease. And the Cherokee also believed that there were evil animal spirits who were taking out their revenge on the Native Americans. And the Vancouver tribes believed in dragon's breath, that there was a dragon living in the river who breathed on children. They got the disease and then adults got sick thereafter. Much belief in witchcraft, blaming people because they were the ones who had cast the spell. In the late 1700s, the natives began to note that Europeans were practicing isolation and quarantine, and they thought maybe that's why they're not getting as much disease as we are, so they began to adopt that practice. In fact, it was kind of cruel because if a person had smallpox, they simply take them outside the village and leave them in the wilderness with no one to care for them. That led to them dying, but it did cut down on spread. And these are some of the drawings that were made by the Aztecs, the Incans, the Mexicans, about the disease and their beliefs associated with it. Now, what about Native American treatments? Well, obviously, they're going to use traditional tribal medicine, which included incantations, and particularly the sweat lodge and then a cold water plunge immediately thereafter. We're having some current experience with that. Willow bark. Well, you know what willow bark is? It's a crude form of aspirin. It's salicylic acid. And so that helped ameliorate fever. They use conifer oil steaming, cathartics and emetic. One of the unusual ones I found was bear oil that was used. They fed bear oil to somebody and they'd vomit like crazy, and they thought that helped. They had curing societies and various kinds of tribal rituals, including fasting and dreaming. The pictures above on the left, on my left, is George Catlin's depiction of a sweat lodge, and this is a more modern sweat lodge, such as the one that we read so much about. Mourning Dove, who was a Salish woman, had transcribed, some tried to use the sweat lodge, but when they jumped into cold water after sweating, they got worse and died faster. It's hard to know because the mortality was so high whether or not they used the sweat lodge. They began then, as I said, to use avoidance and quarantine. And they also then took this witchcraft idea and began sending the disease to their enemies, their traditional enemies, by the shamans and by various rituals. They began to use European medicines. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then variolation became the vogue, and then vaccination, and eventually the disease was actually eliminated. An interesting side note, suicide soared among particularly senior men in the tribe. And one Mandan chief said, "I do not fear death, my friends, but to die with my face rotten, that even the wolves will shrink in horror at seeing me." He could not tolerate that and committed suicide. Now, lest we smile at these Native American beliefs, what did the colonials believe? Well, Richard Zacks, a historian, wrote, "The underlying theory of which most of Western medicine was based for almost 1,000 years was pure bunk." And he's talking about the Aristotle belief in the four major factors: fire, air, water, and earth, and the corresponding humors in the body that Galen developed afterwards of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And all of our practice at the time was based on that. And if you listen to the Revolutionary War talk a few months ago, you learned that that's what they were doing on the battlefield as well. What were they doing? Maintaining the balance. How do you maintain the balance? Besides quackery, you began to bleed and purge and make people vomit and make them pass huge amounts of feces in an attempt to get rid of these bad humors and to bring the body back into balance. What were their practices based on that? Again, it was on the beliefs. Most people did not see a physician. Care was given by their women in their household and by lay healers. And they used a whole variety of things: herbal compounds, natural plants, metals like mercury and tin. Garlic was in use. St. John's wort, still in use today, was widely used. And one account by a physician said that he was able to identify 300 known remedies. After the Boston experience, some practiced violation, and was a huge debate in this country, but eventually vaccination became mandatory and the disease was eliminated. What were the impacts? Massive depopulation. Smallpox was the major cause, but there were many other causes that are listed here. Villages were abandoned. When people finally learned that contact was important, they began to then go back to the more nomadic way. Cultural disorganization. What do you do if 90% of your tribe is gone, or if your leaders are killed off? Blending of cultures, people coming together who were traditional enemies. Loss of oral history and tradition. The people that were providing this generation after generation were dying. Low fertility, that was rather important because it limited the ability of those tribes to come back. And disfigurement, blindness, and lingering after effects, and eventually the transition from virilation and then vaccination with elimination of the disease. Now, there's not much on smallpox in Arizona. I was able to find those things you saw in the Arizona Star articles. And then in Tombstone, Johnny Blair was a member of the Double Dobie gang. He was out rustling cattle when he contracted smallpox. Two of his outlaw friends took him to a Mexican woman who was immune to the dreaded disease. She cared for him about a week before she proclaimed him very dead. Johnny Blair died of smallpox. This is the markings on his gravestone. A cowboy threw a rope over his feet and dragged him to his grave. And there it is on the Boot Hill. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but there is such a cross on a grave on Boot Hill in Tombstone, Arizona. And then Dr. Bledsoe, whom I had no idea who he was, and Steve provided me with his packet, and maybe some of you in this room, how many of you knew of Dr. Bledsoe? A handful of people. He practiced in the Arizona Territory in 1904 in Bisbee, and then moved to Tucson in 1921, and he practiced there for 35 years. But afterwards, he lived to about 98, and he was a very, very prominent physician. He wrote in 1957, I was able to find this withered journal, The History of Medicine in Arizona. And really, what he was talking about is his own experience with smallpox. And he talked about Tin Town near Bisbee, which was near the garbage dump, and that's where they put the smallpox victims. And he would tend to them, and he described some of the cases. He also described the fact that 2 weeks before he was to be married, he came across a hemorrhagic case. This is the worst form of the disease, where a young boy was bleeding with very severe smallpox, and he decided not to tend him because he wanted to be sure that he didn't get smallpox for his marriage ceremony. That's what he describes in this article. And he also influenced me in a way that I didn't realize. He presented a check to Matthews when the medical school was going to be formed, and was part of the effort in Tucson to actually establish the medical school here. What are the conclusions we can draw from this? It did contribute to massive depopulation, and we know that, for example, in that 75-82 epidemic, there were at least 130,000 documented cases of death. The Columbian exchange did result in major cultural alteration in the Americas, and these other diseases also played a role in this virgin population. And we don't think there's solid evidence for deliberate attempts to introduce infection except for that one episode. Now, I provided some classic smallpox references here. Dr. Dixon was an Australian physician who wrote the book on smallpox. You can't even get it anymore. He gave us his copy when he visited us in Denver, and this one is weather-beaten. I tried to get more copies of it, and they're simply out of print. Nobody seems to know where you can get it. But there are some other more modern references. Jenner's smallpox vaccine, Pax Americana, talking about that epidemic from 75 to 82. And then this is the most objective source. It has a horrible title, Rotting Face, but actually this author really made an attempt to understand the literature, and he presents both sides of a story and why he believes one or the other side is more accurate based on the actual record. And then there are other general stories about smallpox that really detail how this disease literally determined dynasties, outcomes of war, and in fact shaped culture in both the Western and Eastern worlds. Dr. Bledsoe's article appeared in Arizona Medicine in June of '57. Halverson wrote a wonderful article on Native American beliefs and medical treatments in what's called the Early American Review. And then the Columbian Exchange has been updated by Crosby to a 2003 publication in which he goes into great detail about the consequences of this exchange. That's the story. Thank you very much. Do we have time for some questions, Jim?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, John.
Not about in the Americas. You're talking about changing history. Catherine the Great, who's going to be more or less an arranged marriage, nothing more, she assumed power when the man who would be czar supposedly had ongoing smallpox for about a year and a half. Is that possible? During this, his face was said to have more or less fallen off.
I haven't read that account. I can't believe you can have ongoing smallpox. It's a very limited disease. You either die or you get better.
He probably had virulent complications.
I'm not sure what that is, John.
Was it really named to differentiate it from the Great Pox? Syphilis?
I didn't go into the history. The question is, what's the Great Pox, the smallpox, the other pox? Remember, people at the time were trying to describe diseases that often had similarities. For example, a lot of what was called measles probably wasn't measles, because we now know there are 100 other viruses that can produce a rash like that. Smallpox was distinct because it had a very characteristic disease. However, when I was at the smallpox hospital in Madras, India, we had routinely admitted patients with chickenpox who were misdiagnosed as smallpox, and that was actually dangerous for them to come into the hospital because their immune status was already impaired, and to expose them to smallpox was terrible. But it was hard to distinguish a severe case of chickenpox from a milder case of smallpox. But the term Great Pox was really applied to syphilis ultimately. And it really, today, we would not have great difficulty distinguishing the two. But in those days, if you got blotches on your skin and fever and you died rapidly, how could people know which it was? Smallpox was distinctive enough that people could separate it out because of the stages it went through.
Keep asking questions, but there's going to be dessert. It's being prepared now.
Rocky?
Not small.
What was the ultimate cause of death in most cases? Was it pneumonia? Was it renal failure? Or what?
It depended on the type of smallpox. As Jim Corrigan knows, the hemorrhagic form of the disease was probably DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation and shock. And in fact, most of the people that died quickly probably died of shock. and its complications, and there weren't good methods of treating in those days. Those that died a little later on were super infected. They would get pneumonia or they would get skin infection. A lot of these patients died with group A beta hemolytic strep and staph infections. In fact, that was one of the leading causes of death in children in the smallpox hospital in Madras. They would come in and they'd have these huge abscesses, and they didn't even have means of dealing with it. They didn't have antibiotics or anything, and a lot of these children died of literally diseases that could have been corrected with appropriate treatment and surgical drainage and antibiotic treatment.
What's the answer to C?
What's C?
C, well, it's the post-lecture test. It says, one of the following statements is true. Mortality from smallpox decimated many Western Indian tribes. That's true. But also, and then the next one says syphilis caused more deaths in American Indians than smallpox.
It did not.
It didn't.
No.
Okay.
It caused more deaths in Europe among people who had survived smallpox. Okay, thank you very much.